It is the 14th of the 9th, the 2025 Sunday morning of. That means there's only one thing, F1 centric threads multitudinous at which we need to put. In the first instance, I've got to fact check people. Max Verstappen, on the back of a successful debut, has now got his license. The 27th of September is when we can next expect to see Maximilian Verstappen. There'd been anticipation that he was going to race today. I have it on good authority that he will not. And who can blame him? A racing man's racer. And I don't hate that. Jump through all of the requisite loops to make sure that he can compete. He wants to flipping race, and I think 99% of the F1 populace fan base globally love him for that. Oh, and by the way, speaking of Red Bull and Maximilian Verstappen, this tweet's important, tweeted out by Dr. Obbs in the first instance, and it talks to how peculiar and temperamental the Red Bull RB21 is now and has been. Season to date, not the quickest, notwithstanding Max dragging it, kicking and screaming to pole positions at the British Grand Prix, Saudi Arabia, Jeddah Corniche. So too, earlier on in the season at Suzuka, the Japanese Grand Prix, despite its multitudinous foibles of the aerodynamic and mechanical variety, snap oversteer from understeer as at the apex, it's been a dog of a car. Don't let anybody tell you anything different, especially if season to date they've been Maximilian Verstappen naysayers. However, all of a sudden at the Monza Italian Grand Prix, it feels like Lauren Mecchi's is Harry Potter settings working magic as far as the Red Bull circumstance. Indeed, the RB21. However, we find out that there were a couple of upgrades that happened leading into that Grand Prix. Again, it's 2025. You would expect Red Bull to be focusing now on 2026 at the altar of the law of diminishing returns. However, they were still bringing upgrades, floors and floor fairings. Here, Rosario Gilina, excuse my poor pronunciation. Your boy can't get the words out today. At Monza, Verstappen's RB21 was equipped with the new approved micro modifications spread across all modules, designed exclusively based on CFD simulations. I think that's floor fairings. At the top of the screen on the right hand side of, you see the old Red Bull floor fairings. At the bottom you see that my very noddy B-spec mind can barely discern the difference. You mean to tell me you upgrade something so small, millimetre small, and then all of a sudden you build yourself a Red Bull racing car capable of winning races? And hopefully for those invested in a levelling of the competitive landscape in 2.5 championships. Oh, and by the way, I've got to talk to you about this because that McLaren circumstance is getting chaotic. Ever since they intervened and inverted, played racing gods, the F1 world has been talking about it. Toto Wolff in the first instance, because it doesn't feel good, does it? I want to see a proper Formula One race with X factor and changing circumstance, uncertainty. And when Zach Brown and Andrea Stella keep meddling, I don't know, it takes the F1 out of F1. How can you have an F1 race without uncertainty? Of course, sometimes there will be mistakes made in pit stops. 5.9 seconds, that was where Lando Norris's victory fight for second even at the previous Grand Prix at the Italian fell foul. Toto Wolff said to that as far as McLaren inverting unnecessarily, that he set a precedent that is very difficult to undo. And this is Toto Wolff talking from experience now. He's dealing with Antonelli now and George Russell. George Russell makes the decision a non-decision because he's so roundly outperforming Andrea Kimi Antonelli. However, in 2016, when Toto had to juggle fire-breathing dragons in Lewis and Nico, both of whom were competing for the championship then, he had to institute for proper rules, make it contractual, and fines after 2016, the Spanish Grand Prix, when the two of them, Lewis and Nico, came together. Here's what Toto says though. You set a precedent that is very difficult to undo. What if the team does another mistake and it's not a pit stop, like, I don't know, a DNF from Lando Norris, Dutch Grand Prix? What if the team does another mistake and it's not a pit stop? Do you switch them around then? But then equally, because of a team mistake, making a driver that is trying to catch up lose points is not fair either. That's Toto Wolff, Toto the boy who cried wolf, per the race on McLaren's decision to invert. Now, it doesn't rest well with me, but there are people that have talked about this, and this is important, chat, because all F1 journalistic publications are created equally, but some are created more equal than others. Andrew Benson of the BBC, he's the guy, right? He's Mr. Truth, Value and Objectivity. Barely takes a step off the fence. He's always straight down the line, straight shooter, a thinking shooter of a journo, but never ever controversial, because he's the BBC's guy on the Checkered Flag podcast extra. He gets off the fence. I'm telling you, this is techie chat. I'm telling you. Again, having a conversation with Harry Benjamin, and he starts talking about the McLaren circumstance. Here's what they have to say in the first instance.
If it was the two drivers were from different teams and that had happened at Monza, it would have just been bad luck for Norris. Now, of course, McLaren say, well, if there was two different teams, it wouldn't have gone that way. Well, no, it wouldn't. But, so I think this is why it's so interesting. There's no right or wrong answers here. There's no blame. There's no blame for McLaren. I don't think. It's just you just have to look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. They've chosen to do it this way. And it's very unlike, for example, Webber against Vettel at Red Bull in 2010 when they were battling for the championship. Although the team, actually, Red Bull, were trying to intervene. They were trying to intervene in Vettel's favour, and Webber was like resisting it the whole time. That's what the fundamentals of that fight were. And
or even later on, when you had like Multi 21 and things like that. Yeah. That was supposed to go in Webber's favour, and Vettel disregarded.
Just went, yeah, must be joking. What was it he said? I was faster, I passed him, I won.
Yeah.
I was faster, I passed him, I won. That was what Seb Vettel had to say to Mark Webber and Red Bull about their circumstance. And part of me just wants Oscar to do that, right? Double down. Do you want to be a champion or not? At some point, Oscar Piastri, if that were to happen again, I know you're 31 points to the good, and we haven't too many. I mean, we're very firmly into H2 of the championship in 2025. But at some point, Oscar, you're going to have to stand up and make a decision. Stand on business. Go 10 toes down. Are you not? Just like Seb Vettel did Multi 21 settings with Mark Webber, just like Michael Schumacher did as Neos makes no difference every single bloody rate, just like Nico Rosberg did in 2016, just like every champion worthy of note has done in F1 history. Maximilian Verstappen at Brazil, Checo Perez. What, you think I'm going to let that chap overtake me? I told you in summer not to even ask me that question again. Come on, OJP, it's time to stand on business. And if past his prologue, I think it will happen again over the next couple of races when the promise, the stakes that is a championship of the drivers' variety starts to come to the fore. Previously having faded to black, now they get techie, talking about Rosberg and Hamilton past his prologue. Of course, it's going to happen again. Here's Benson, Checkered Flag podcast extra. Roll the clip.
It is interesting, and maybe it is the fact that Piastri could afford to just lose a couple of points. He did have that little bit of pushback, but in the end, let Norris through. And maybe we're just not used to seeing this kind of thing from drivers fighting for a championship, are we? These two are. Maybe this is the new way that McLaren are sort of operating and changing the way we go Formula One racing, because, Rosberg, Hamilton never would have happened. Prost, Senna never would have happened at I would say, any stage of their championship fight throughout a season. Whereas, okay, last year, maybe it's a weaker comparison, but we saw at times where Norris was clearly the stronger driver and going for an outside bet at the championship. I think it was the Sao Paulo sprint where Piastri helped him and let Norris through. And then on the final lap of the Qatar sprint, Norris at the final corner moved out of the way and let Piastri through to take the sprint win. Yes, it's a sprint win, less points. Okay, they weren't tooth and nail, but they have this new ethos clearly at McLaren. Is that all down to Stella and
techie than techie things? Of course, that's Harry Benjamin and not Andrew Benson. You'll excuse me, I stand corrected. But Harry Benjamin makes a couple pertinent points there. Prost and Senna, 89. Excuse me, Alan. So we made a mistake with Senna in the pits. Could you Could you invert? Absolutely not going to happen. Don't even waste your breath. Nico and Lewis 2016. Nico said on the podcast the other day that at Monaco, they'd agreed by then, enshrined, crystallised some rules of engagement that if either one of them were at risk at sacrificing the race victory, then they would invert. Then they would deploy no effect in real time for some team orders. That aside, though, when it was 2:30, when it got to the crunch time, you think Nico or Lewis were going to start to obey team orders? Not on your Nelly. Why? Because they're fire-breathing dragons. I think this has gone too far over at McLaren. The papaya rules are making a mockery. No, bringing the sport into disrepute. Attention dollars for the last 12, 24 months have been doing one of these gangbuster season after gangbuster season. It's been instance after instance. Last time round, of course, it was Lando and Maximilian Verstappen. We believed that it was uncertain whether Max Verstappen was going to win his 4th on the trot because Lando made us think twice. It looked techier than techie things. Now, all of a sudden, you've got this non-championship championship. McLaren keep putting their hand on the bloody competitive landscape. Weighing scales, what are they doing? Leave it alone. 5.9 seconds. Well, that's off your doing. Do you know what I mean? Stop playing the racing gods. Now, Harry Benjamin, as his footnote, bookends his soliloquy this way, saying maybe that's a new way of doing things that McLaren are instituting for. Has that got something to do with Andrea Stella? There's a piece in here where they're talking about, I didn't record it because you boys noddy. It's at Sunday morning settings, but there's a piece in here where they talk about Andrea Stella's controlling nature, almost OCD settings. Andrew Benson tells the story that when Andrea Stella's about to conduct one of many McLaren press conferences in their hospitality pen, tent, lorry, that Andrea Stella, all the journalists, the accredited F1 journos, throw their phones down onto the table. You might have seen pictures of this already on the interwebs, Googles, but all the F1 journos, the accredited ones, throw down their phones to record every syllable of what Andrea Stella's saying even. So on the table in front of Stella, you have like a sea of random phones splayed across the table. Andrea Stella, so OCD is this chap in his nature that he lines them up almost into a fan formation. That, ladies and gentlemen, is OCD. And you're not going to tell me a dude that controlling about something so trivial, so inconsequential, is not going to institute for that same controlling manner as far as the way that he conducts his activities over at McLaren and the driver pairing. Inversion, if they invert, it is Andrea Stella and Zach Brown's doing. They will have dictated so. And there's another god tier soliloquy, right? Here's where it gets techier than techie things. Roll the clip.
I mean, look, you're beginning to hear people say things like, I think they're favouring Norris, really. You know, I hadn't felt that myself, and I still don't feel that myself. But when people say that, you can sort of see why they might think it. You know, when you start to add up what's happened this year, you know, they've made this special suspension part for Norris, particularly for Norris, to help him feel the front axle better. Yeah, and Piastri's not adopted it now. In theory, it's not a performance advantage, but if it helps him access more of the car's potential because he's got better feel and Piastri doesn't need it, then it is potentially a performance advantage for him, isn't it? I don't think that's the case, by the way. I think they're just trying to be fair.
But almost you can be too fair in a way where it starts to have a detrimental effect, because at the end of the day, they're not being threatened by any other team for the constructors. So it's not about the whole maximizing points thing, really. I mean, Danielle picks up on this, and I think this is on your F1 Q&A as well, which you can see on the BBC Sport website. She's asked, thinking about the battle between the McLaren drivers for the championship, to what extent does a driver have their own team in Formula One? To what extent are there people...
Chaos merchant. Absolute chaos merchant. Benson puts it more succinctly than I ever could dream of. Again, remember, all F1 journos are created equal, but some are created more equal than others. Benson at the BBC now talking to the point that McLaren could potentially be instituting for favouritism at the altar of Lando Norris. Remember, here's what you need to know historically, season to date. Lando Norris didn't like the MCL and its handling dynamic in the first instance. Of course, it was a brilliant car, double brake that minimises for the rate at which its tyres deg in a way that none of the other cars can on the grid. That's why it's so bloody quick. That's why, though, when they get around the most frequently occurring climatic circumstance, hot weather, medium to high speed turns, McLaren goes gangbusters, goes in to a completely different stratosphere. None of the other cars can cope with it. I would bet that even Red Bull, with its upgraded floor and floor fares, when we get around Baku and Singapore, that it will still struggle to keep, even in the hands of Maximilian Verstappen, four-time champion, GOAT settings, Mount Rushmore of F1, first round Hall of Fame, even in his hands, that car, that McLaren, will still be the class of the field. Lest we forget, however, at the start of 2025, Lando didn't like it. It was a bit understeery. Lando likes it properly on the nose, just like Max, just like Lewis, just like Charles. And his handling dynamic, the way that he steals the car, his particular driving style doesn't speak well to that. Lando complained, and what did they do? They tinkered with the suspension geometry. You recall Lando Norris yeeting the car into the barrier during Saudi Arabia quali. That was, of course, because he was struggling with the handling dynamic of the car. You know as well, Lando likes to experience feedback from the car, what it's doing, understeer, oversteer, whether you're on or around the traction limits. He likes to experience this through the steering wheel. We know that the McLaren MCL 39 wasn't giving him the requisite feedback through the steering wheel that he so needs and loves, with a view to optimise for lap time. Andrea Stella realised this. Zach Brown realised this too, and they started tinkering with the car to make sure that Lando can get what he needs out of it. Oscar Piastri said to those two bits and bobs, you know what, they're not upgrades. They don't increase. There is no upside in terms of absolute terms performance. So I don't need those bits and bobs. There's your Exhibit A. Exhibit B, this Grand Prix inverting. This was racing. What are you talking about? This is nonsense. Why are you inverting at the Italian Grand Prix? Because of a 5.9 second pit stop. Lando Norris as well. Very crafty. He wanted to make sure if there were a discounted pit stop to be had because of a virtual safety car or a full safety car, that he would be out on the track to gain some advantage from it. So why don't you pit the other car, aka OJP, first? Just in case. Lando's playing this game very well. Mr. Politicking. I see you, Lando Norris, and I see the favouritism that comes with it. And you understand the root cause of it, right? Lando has been McLaren's guy, Zach Brown's guy for the longest time. I mean, he's been at the team all of his F1 career, right? Had the opportunity to sign a contract with Red Bull because Christian Horner, once upon a time, was keen to partner him with his charge, Max Verstappen. Lando said, no, you know what? I'm going to see this out. When nobody had faith in McLaren, when the cash flow, the reserves were low, Lando Norris said, you know, I'm going to stick with this team. This is my team. And that's why Zach Brown, some say, sees Lando Norris as his prodigal. So that's why they're tinkering around with the car to make sure Lando Norris can handle it. That's why they're dialing out the understeer element of the MCL 39. That's why they're trying to make sure Lando's getting the requisite feedback through the steering wheel to make sure he can keep up with OJP in only his third season. That's why they're tinkering around with suspension geometry. Oh, and by the way, Benson goes into deep detail now. This is where he gets techie and techie things, because I'm not the only one to say this now, chat. Don't do your own research always. Inherently insecure. I think I'm the noddiest of noddy F1 minds always, and so will always defer to the experts, the insiders in the paddock, the in the know guys and girls. And Andrew Benson cites one here and says that by the way that the way that McLaren have been conducting their activities has not been fair. Or the clip.
There comes a point where individuality stops and collectivism starts, and it's that boundary, that grey area, that gets complicated, and where it's got complicated in a number of ways at McLaren already this year. So the other example that I meant to bring up just in the last answer, when we were talking about this impression that people are getting that McLaren might be favouring Norris, is the Hungarian Grand Prix this year, where Norris made a mess of the first lap. He was in all the wrong places on the run to the first corner, and after he ended up dropping down to fifth place, I think it was, wasn't it? And Piastri was battling Charles Leclerc for the win. And they kept Piastri on their pre-race plan of a two-stop strategy. And when it came time for Norris's pit stop, they left him out. And the plan at the time, they say, was not to run him onto a one-stop. It was just to do an offset two-stop to give him some kind of advantage over the cars he was racing, which at the time was George Russell's Mercedes. But it just so happened that as things developed, his tyres came back a bit and he felt he could go longer, and he turned onto a one-stop and he ended up beating Piastri. Now, I've spoken to a senior person at another team who thinks that that was not fair. That in the way teams run normally, you should never allow the guy who's fifth on the first lap to beat the guy who's second on the first lap by operating a different strategy. But that's just his opinion, you know. And McLaren is saying, well, they're battling for the championship. It makes no difference to us as a team which driver wins. So we think that they can choose their own strategy and try and beat each other. But again, it all gets a bit murky and difficult, it is a valid question to ask. Well, what if such and such happens? To
what extent do you deliver upon this thesis? Is that really the plan? I think Andrew Benson makes the pertinent points there, per an F1 insider, that this isn't fair. It didn't feel fair at the time. That's why so many F1 fans walked away and said, no, this leaves a bad taste in the mouth, particularly if you remember only a couple of races previous at Hungary, where Lando Norris was allowed to do what George Russell did last year at the Spa-Francorchamps Grand Prix to Lewis Hamilton. He was allowed to plough his own strategic furrow, right? Go one stop. And again, this is one of those ones where sometimes it's just racing, but do that across the board, surely, McLaren, and stop putting your bloody thumb on the scales. Michael, Apple TV. We'll talk about Apple TV very briefly. Oscar wants payback, says Joey Patrick. Big time, and McLaren are forced by public demand to honour this. Watch this space. I think it's only a matter of time. Umar says the floor is flooring. Go on, let's talk. As we round third base, let's talk very quickly about Apple TV. Here's what I know. ESPN don't want to be in the F1 business. There is something going on with old world media, particularly around sports. If you look at boxing, I mean, we'll discuss Bud Crawford a little bit later on. Do you know what I mean? Don't tell me that I didn't tell you so. Bud Crawford, a generational talent, the likes of which we have at the moment in Maximilian Verstappen, very similar. But listen, here's what ESPN do not want to do. The operating cost of running sports broadcasts across the board, particularly in automotive pugilism, boxing has done one of these to where the bottom line is negligible. They're not earning any money. HBO weren't, Showtime weren't, and ESPN a similar story as far as Formula One and their sports portfolio more broadly. Why would you continue barking up a zero EBITDA tree? If you are not earning money, then you can't do it. Run it leaner, potentially earn more money, but there's no way to do that if you're talking about boxing, and now if you're talking about F1 for ESPN. So they're not prepared. They were paying $5 million for the North American TV rights previously, and that made sense, right? Particularly when Attention Dollars were doing one of these. They were the first follower, let's say, after the F1 success, even Drive to Survive COVID 2021 gangbuster season. Now, however, it's a bit different. When you're asked to pay $5 million and $80 million next time round, that makes sense. Now you're competing with Apple TV, who are set to pay anywhere between $140 million and $200 million for the exclusive US TV rights to show F1. That's techier than techie things. Said, therefore, for Apple TV to be the favourites. Now, I don't know what it's going to look like. I can't make any promises. I can't say that their coverage is going to be God tier nor purple sectors. It's all speculation. However, that being said, Apple don't tend to mess around when they deal with when they expand their sports portfolio, when they put on these games. I've heard speculation is that they don't tend to mess around, and here's hoping they do the same. It's techie. The floor is falling, weren't it too much? The floor is falling, mate. They've upgraded, but I still think McLaren have the whip hand. We'll see. This time next weekend, we'll know more, right? And then Oscar wanting payback. About bloody time. Gary Patrick, do you know what I mean? He has to get payback. He's Oscar Piastri, for Pete's sake. And that dude wants nothing more than to win races and his maiden championship in 2025. Expedite for his learning curve, just as he has done the previous TCs. And it's going to get techier than techie things. Chat. Have a fantastic Sunday. Between now and next time, the prosecution rests. No further questions, Your Honour.